The wind came down off the Rockies the way it always did in late September. Not politely, not gradually, but all at once, slamming into the valley like a fist through paper. It rattled the loose boards on Harlan Briggs's general store. It knocked the hanging lantern above the livery into a long, swaying arc. It sent a decade's worth of dead leaves skittering across the single dirt road that Red Hollow, Montana, had the audacity to call its main street. Most folks ducked inside when that wind showed up, pulled their hats down, their collars up, and waited it out over coffee or whiskey, depending on the hour and the disposition. Garrick Hale stood in the middle of the road and let it hit him straight on. He was a big man, not in the showy, puffed-up way of men who wanted you to notice their size, but in the settled, immovable way of a tree that had been growing in the same spot for 30 years. Wide shoulders beneath a worn canvas coat. Hands that were scarred across the knuckles from fencing wire and cold weather. A jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that broke up the western pasture. He was 41 years old, and he looked every one of them, and he didn't seem to mind. He stood there because he was watching the road north. The afternoon stage was late. It was usually late. But today it carried someone that Amos Pickard at the telegraph office had warned him about 3 days prior, with a note that said, in Amos's cramped, suspicious handwriting, "School teacher, woman, coming Tuesday. Town council says she's your problem since the old schoolhouse is on your land. Figured you should know before she just showed up." Garrick had read that note twice, folded it in half, and used it to level out a wobbly fence post. He was not a man who did things out of charity. He had been clear about that for years. When Red Hollow needed money for repairs on the water well, Garrick had donated, but he'd also made sure it was documented as a business arrangement, because he believed firmly that gifts made people soft and contracts made things honest. When the Henderson family lost their barn to a fire 2 winters back, Garrick had sent 3 of his hands over with lumber and helped rebuild it. But he'd come personally, only long enough to make sure the job was done right, then left without staying for supper. He was not unkind. He had simply learned, the hard way, that getting involved in other people's lives had a cost that didn't always show up on the ledger until it was too late. The stage appeared at the northern bend, trailing a rooster tail of pale dust, and Garrick crossed his arms over his chest and waited. He had not planned to be the one to meet it. He had told himself, walking into town that afternoon, that he was only coming in to pick up a hardware order from Briggs's and maybe talk to Emmett Cross about a grazing dispute that had been brewing for 2 weeks. The school teacher was not his business. The town could sort itself out. And then he'd ended up standing in the middle of the road watching the stage come in. He didn't examine that too closely. The coach swayed to the stop in front of Briggs's in a cloud of grit, and Pete Dunmore, who had been driving the Red Hollow stage for 11 years with varying degrees of sobriety, climbed down from the box and opened the door with the creaking ceremony of a man who took small dignities seriously. 2 passengers. A cattle buyer from Billings that Garrick recognized and didn't particularly like, a round man named Fowler who sweated regardless of temperature, and then the school teacher. She was not what he expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. Something more brittle, maybe, or more carefully put together. Eastern women who came west usually arrived in one of 2 states, either terrified and already regretting it, or performing a kind of theatrical bravery that collapsed within the first hard winter. He had seen both, and both had exhausted him. Vivian Mercer stepped out of the stagecoach and looked at Red Hollow the way a surveyor looks at unfamiliar terrain, measuring it, cataloging it, noting its deficiencies without flinching from them. She was somewhere in her early 30s, with dark hair pinned back severely enough that a few strands had escaped and were losing the battle against the wind. Her dress was practical and gray and somewhat dusty. She carried a leather satchel in one hand and was followed out of the stage by a trunk that was so heavy Pete Dunmore swore under his breath getting it down. She looked at the trunk, looked at Pete, and said, "I can take one end if you need help." Pete blinked at her. "Ma'am?" "The trunk. You look like you're about to put your back out." Pete straightened up, offended, and managed the trunk himself through what Garrick suspected was pure injured pride. Vivian Mercer looked around Main Street with those measuring eyes. She looked at the shuttered front of what had been the schoolhouse, a sad, sagging building at the east end of the road that hadn't been used in 2 years. She looked at the general store, the livery, the saloon, and the gap where the hotel had burned down in 1882 and nobody had gotten around to replacing yet. And then she looked at Garrick. He was still standing in the middle of the road. "You're blocking traffic," she said. "There isn't any traffic." "Well, if there were." He studied her for a moment. "You're the school teacher." "Vivian Mercer," she said, and didn't extend her hand, not out of rudeness, he thought, but because she was holding too many things. "And you're Garrick Hale. Amos Pickard described you." "How?" "He said you'd be the big quiet one who looked like he'd rather be somewhere else." She glanced around again. "Where's the schoolhouse?" "End of the road," Garrick said. "But it's been closed since—" "I know it's been closed. That's why they needed a teacher." She looked at him steadily. "Is there somewhere I can stay while I get it sorted out?" The town council's letter mentioned accommodations would be arranged. Garrick thought about the town council. He thought about what he knew of them, which was that they were 4 men who liked to make decisions and then leave the execution of those decisions to whoever was closest and most difficult to refuse. He thought about the note in his pocket, the one he'd used for the fence post. "The hotel burned," he said. "I noticed. There's a boarding house on 2nd Street, but Mrs. Aldrich is—" He paused, selecting his words. "She has specific standards." "Such as?" "She doesn't take women traveling alone." Vivian absorbed this without visible distress. "What are my other options?" This was the moment where Garrick could have suggested the saloon had a room above it, which was technically true, though he wouldn't have put a dog in it, or that she could send word to Billings and stay there while the town sorted out its accommodations problem. Both would have been accurate. Both would have been reasonable. Instead, he heard himself say, "I've got a barn." She looked at him. "Clean," he added. "There's a room at the back. Used to be for my foreman before he built his own place. Got a stove, a cot, a window." Vivian studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not suspicion, something more careful than that. Like she was trying to determine whether the offer was exactly what it appeared to be, or whether there was a secondary ledger somewhere she hadn't seen yet. "How much?" she asked. "Nothing. It's a barn." "Nothing is never nothing, Mr. Hale." He almost said something sharp to that because it was the kind of statement that irritated him. The sort of philosophical declaration people made when they were trying to sound worldly. But then he looked at her face and decided she wasn't performing. She meant it as a practical observation, and she was waiting for a practical answer. "Call it a favor to the town," he said. "I want to see Red Hollow have a school again. The kids around here have been running wild for 2 years." She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when they've reached a decision they're not entirely comfortable with but can live with. "Thank you," she said. "I'll arrange something more permanent as soon as I can." "Sure," said Garrick, and went to help Pete with the trunk. The Hale Ranch sat 3 miles east of town, up a gradual rise that gave you a long view of the valley in the late afternoon light. It was the kind of view that stopped people the first time they saw it. The way the grass went amber and gold in September, the way the creek caught the sun in broken pieces, the way the mountains to the west stood up dark and permanent against the sky. Garrick had grown up with that view and stopped seeing it somewhere around the time he turned 30 and got too busy looking at the ground under his feet instead of what was in front of him. He watched Vivian see it for the first time from the seat of his wagon. She didn't say anything. She just looked, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened up slightly, the way a shutter opens when someone remembers to unlatch it. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, still looking out at the valley. "Born here," Garrick said. "Inherited it when my father died. Added to it since." "It's beautiful." "It's land," he said. "Beautiful doesn't feed cattle." She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in it, not quite amusement, not quite challenge, something that sat between the two. "You don't believe that?" "I believe in what I can measure." "Then why do you have that?" She pointed. He looked where she was pointing. Off to the north of the main house, up on a slight rise, stood the skeleton of a building, framing up, walls partially raised, a roof line that had been started and then stopped. It had been sitting like that for almost 3 years. His hands had learned not to bring it up. "That's nothing," he said. "It's a house," Vivian said. "Or it was going to be." "Leave it." She left it. but he felt the question sitting in the air between them the rest of the drive, and he was irritated by how much it bothered him that she'd noticed. His foreman, Cutter Walsh, was waiting in the yard when the wagon pulled in. Cutter was 52 and leathery, and had been working the Hale Ranch since before Garrick was born, which gave him a kind of tenure that meant he said whatever he thought, and Garrick listened even when he didn't want to. Cutter looked at Vivian. He looked at Garrick. He looked at the trunk in the wagon bed. "School teacher?" he said. "Town's got nowhere to put her," Garrick said, climbing down. "We've got the foreman's room." "That's what I told her." Cutter reached up and helped Vivian down from the wagon with a formality that surprised Garrick a little. Cutter was not generally a formal man. "Ma'am, Cutter Walsh. I run this operation, more or less." "Vivian Mercer." She shook his hand. "More or less?" "He thinks he runs it," Cutter said, nodding toward Garrick. "We let him." Garrick picked up the trunk by himself, which was harder than he made it look, and started toward the barn. He heard Cutter behind him saying something to Vivian that made her laugh. A real laugh, short and unguarded, and he was annoyed to find that it was a sound he wanted to hear again. The foreman's room was, as promised, clean. It was small, barely enough space for the cot, a table, a chair, and the small iron stove in the corner. But someone had put effort into it once, and the effort showed in the way the walls had been finished and the single window faced west so you got the afternoon light. Garrick set the trunk down, stepped back, and looked around the room with fresh eyes, trying to see what she was seeing. It occurred to him suddenly that the last person who had slept in this room was Clara. Not slept in it exactly, but in the months after they lost the baby, after they lost both of them, his wife and their son, in one terrible February night, Clara's mother had come out from Billings to stay, and she had used this room because Clara's sister was in the main house, and the main house was too small and too full of grief anyway. That had been 6 years ago. Since then, it had been the foreman's room again, and his foreman had eventually moved into the building he'd put up on the south edge of the property, and the room had just been a room. He hadn't thought about it. He thought about it now. "This will do fine," Vivian said from behind him, and he realized he'd been standing in the doorway staring at nothing for too long. "There's a pump outside," he said, stepping back. "Cutter will show you. Meals are at the main house. You don't have to, but you're welcome." "I don't want to impose." "You're already here," he said. "It's not more imposition to come eat." She looked at him steadily. "You're a strange kind of generous, Mr. Hale." "I'm not generous," he said. "I'm practical. A person has to eat." He left before she could say anything else, and he walked back toward the main house with the wind at his back, and he told himself very firmly that this was a temporary arrangement and she would be out of his barn and into something more suitable within the month, and that would be the end of it. The old schoolhouse on the east end of Main Street was, Vivian determined after her first inspection, a disaster with ambitions. The roof leaked in 3 places. 2 of the 4 windows were cracked. The floorboards had been colonized by something. She didn't investigate too closely. In the years since the last teacher, a young man named Orville Stacks had left for better prospects in Helena and taken most of the books with him. The wood stove was present, but had not been cleaned since what appeared to be the Grant administration. The single chalkboard was intact, which she counted as a mercy. She stood in the middle of the dusty, defeated room and made a list in her head. She had made lists her whole life. Her late husband, Thomas, had called it her armor, the way she turned problems into tasks and tasks into steps and steps into things that could be done one at a time until the problem was gone. It had driven him crazy sometimes. It had also kept them both functional through 2 miscarriages and a drought year, and the winter Thomas's cough went from bad to terminal. Lists didn't fix anything, but they gave you somewhere to put your feet. Roof, windows, floor, stove, supplies, books. She paused. Students. That last one was the real question. 2 years of no school had a way of disrupting habits. The children of Red Hollow had either been working alongside their parents, running loose, or, for those whose families had the means, sent to Billings or beyond for their education. Getting them back into a classroom was going to require more than just fixing a building. She was still standing there making her list when the door opened and 2 boys peered in. They were maybe 11 and 9 respectively. The older one dark-haired and watchful, The younger one red-headed and apparently constitutionally incapable of standing still. They stared at her. She stared back. "Are you the teacher?" the older one asked. "I am," she said. "Are you students?" "Depends on whether school's going to be any good," said the younger one. "Tommy," said the older one, sharp. "What? It's a fair question." Vivian looked at the younger boy, Tommy, with something approaching respect. "That is a fair question," she said. "It's going to depend on what you mean by good." "Means interesting," Tommy said. "Not just sitting and copying things." "What do you want to learn?" Tommy thought about it with genuine seriousness. "How to figure out how much fence wire you need for a pasture," he said. "My pa always does it wrong, and then we don't have enough and have to go back to town." "That's geometry," Vivian said. "And arithmetic. What else?" "Why the creek runs different in wet years than dry ones," the older boy said, quieter. He looked slightly embarrassed to be admitting interest. "My pa says it's just rain, but there's more to it, I think." "There is," Vivian said. "That's geology and hydrology, and you're right that there's more to it." She looked at them both. "My name is Mrs. Mercer. What are yours?" "Daniel Prentice," said the older one. "Tommy Prentice," said the other. "His brother." "How many children your age are in Red Hollow right now?" Daniel and Tommy exchanged a look. "Maybe 15, 20, Daniel said. "Some of them left. The Coopers went to Billings. Harmon kids are in Helena now. But there are still some here." "Yeah." Vivian looked around the ruined schoolhouse. She looked at the cracked windows and the colonized floorboards and the stove that hadn't been cleaned since Reconstruction. "All right," she said. "Tell you what, you help me find out who's still here and willing to come back to school, and I'll make sure the school is worth coming back to. Do we have a deal?" Daniel considered this with the gravity of a contract negotiation. Tommy just stuck out his hand and said, "Deal." She shook it. That evening, Vivian came to dinner at the main house. She'd almost talked herself out of it. She'd stood outside the barn for a long moment after cleaning up, hands in her coat pockets, looking at the light in the main house windows and telling herself she didn't want to impose. But the wind off the mountains was cold, and she hadn't eaten since a dry piece of bread on the stage, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the real hesitation wasn't courtesy. It was the fact that Garrick Hale made her nervous in a way she couldn't fully account for. Not threatened nervous, not uncomfortable nervous. Something else. Something that felt like the moment before you step onto ice, where you're not sure yet whether it'll hold. She knocked. Cutter opened the door. "Mrs. Mercer, come in." The main house was big without being grand, which was a distinction Vivian felt immediately. A rancher's house, built for use rather than impression. High ceilings for summer heat, heavy doors for winter wind, floors worn smooth by decades of boots and work, and people moving through the business of staying alive. A long table in the kitchen. Copper pots above the stove. A row of boots by the door, each pair showing different kinds of hard use. Garrick was at the table reading what appeared to be an invoice. He looked up when she came in, nodded once, and went back to reading. Cutter was cooking something that smelled like beef and onions and competence. A young hand named Remy, who Vivian judged to be no more than 19, was sitting at the other end of the table whittling something she couldn't identify and watching everything with the bright, anxious interest of someone who was new to his situation. "Sit wherever," Cutter said. She sat across from Garrick because the other chairs were already half-claimed by jackets and work gloves and the general accumulation of a household run by people too busy to put things away properly. Garrick set the invoice down. "How was the schoolhouse?" "A project," she said. "Bad?" "Repairable. The structure's sound. Everything else is trouble." "What do you need?" She looked at him, slightly surprised by the directness. "For the school? You told me you wanted to see it open." "I said I wanted to see it open. That makes it a shared problem." He paused. "I'm not offering to pay for everything. I'm asking what's most urgent." "Roof," she said. "Without that, nothing else matters." "I'll send Cutter up there with 2 hands this week. I'm not asking you to—" "I know you're not asking," he said. "I'm offering. There's a difference." He picked up the invoice again. "What else?" She hesitated. "Windows? Supplies? I'll need to see what Briggs's carries and books. I had a collection, but they're heavy to transport, and I left most of them in—" She stopped. "Where?" Connecticut, she said after a pause that was slightly too long to be casual. I'll write and see if I can arrange for some of them to be sent. Garrick lowered the invoice again and looked at her. Not in an intrusive way, not prying, just with a steady attention that she found slightly uncomfortable because it suggested he'd noticed the pause. He didn't ask about Connecticut. Briggs's has a limited stock, he said, but there's a bookseller in Billings that does mail order. I have his address somewhere. Thank you, she said. Cutter set food on the table and the conversation shifted. Remy had a question about something he'd seen in the North Pasture, and Cutter had opinions about it, and the meal moved the way meals do in working households, in pieces and interruptions and practical observations about things that needed doing. Vivian ate and listened and watched Garrick, who talked when he had something to say, and went quiet when he didn't, which was a quality she had come to appreciate in people after years of being surrounded by those who felt silence needed to be filled at all times. He noticed her watching. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked at her for a moment, level and unreadable, and then looked back at whatever Remy was asking about. She ate the rest of her meal and told herself again that this was temporary, that she would be in her own situation soon, that she was here to open a school and not to be unsettled by a quiet rancher who offered barn rooms and sent hands to fix roofs without being asked twice. She was not entirely successful. The school opened on the first Monday of October, 3 weeks after Vivian arrived. It was not a grand opening. The roof had been patched. Cutter's crew had done it in 2 days, grumbling but competent. And the windows had been replaced, and the stove had been cleaned by Vivian herself over the course of an afternoon that she declined to describe in detail to anyone. The floor had been swept within an inch of its life. She had borrowed 3 of her own books from her trunk, requisitioned 4 more from Briggs's irregular stock, and written letters to the Billings bookseller and 3 colleagues back east who she thought might be willing to donate. 14 students showed up that first morning. She had not expected 14, she had hoped for 8. When they came through the door, ranging from Tommy Prentice, age 9, who arrived first by approximately 20 minutes, to a quiet girl named Adeline Cross, age 15, who came in last and sat in the back corner looking like she expected to be told she was too old. Vivian felt something that she recognized from experience as the particular terrifying weight of having gotten what you asked for. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 14 faces looking back at her. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," said several of them. "My name is Mrs. Mercer. I am your teacher, and I want to tell you something before we do anything else." She looked around the room. "I don't believe in wasting time. I don't believe in teaching things that have no use. I believe in teaching you things you will actually need, and things that will make you curious enough to learn more on your own. Is that agreeable?" A long pause. "What kinds of things?" Adeline Cross asked from the back, cautious. "How to read contracts so nobody cheats you," Vivian said. "How to calculate what you owe and what you're owed. How to write a letter that says what you mean. How to understand why land behaves the way it does. And weather and water." She paused. "And history. Because people who don't know where they came from tend to make the same mistakes twice." Another pause. Then Tommy Prentice said, "That's more interesting than I thought school would be." Several people laughed. The tension in the room shifted, not dissolved, but eased, the way a knot loosens before it comes undone. "Get out paper," Vivian said. "We're going to start with what you already know." But word traveled, as it does in small towns, in the particular way of things that people are pretending not to care about while paying close attention. By the end of the first week, 2 more students had appeared. By the second week, 3 adults, including Mabel Griggs, who ran the laundry and was 37 and had always wanted to learn to read properly, were asking tentatively whether there was any possibility of evening sessions. Vivian said yes to all of it. She was running on very little sleep and a stubbornness that she recognized as a family trait. Her mother, before she died, had called it the Mercer affliction, the inability to look at a problem without trying to solve it, the compulsion to keep going even when going was hard. It was not always an asset. It had gotten her into trouble before. But here, in this dust-blown valley, with its sad schoolhouse and its hungry children, it felt like the right kind of affliction to have. Garrick appeared at the school on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks in. She was alone. The students had gone home. The evening session didn't start for another hour. Writing lesson plans at the desk when she heard boots on the porch and looked up to find him in the doorway. He was carrying something. A crate, wooden, clearly heavy. "Books," he said, setting it on the nearest desk. "From Billings. I rode out there on Tuesday for another thing and stopped by the bookseller." She stood up and came around the desk to look. It was a serious collection. Not random, not a dump of whatever the bookseller wanted to clear out. History, mathematics, natural science, a grammar reference. 2 novels that she could see immediately were sophisticated choices for older students. "You picked these yourself?" she asked. "I described what you were teaching. He made recommendations. I told him the range of ages." He straightened up. "There's an invoice in the crate. I'll subtract it from the barn when you figure out what you owe." "I told you I would arrange my own." "I know what you told me," he said, with a patience that she found slightly maddening because it didn't feel like condescension, just equanimity. "But I was there, and they were available, and you needed them. It's practical." She looked at the books. She looked at him. "You keep saying that," she said. "Practical. Because it usually is. Is it practical to ride 2 days round trip to Billings to buy books for a school on your land?" Something moved behind his eyes. A shift she couldn't name, brief enough that she might have imagined it. "I wanted to see what he had in stock," he said. The books were a secondary consideration. She didn't believe him. She was fairly sure he didn't believe him either, but she let it go because there was a line between pressing someone and pushing them, and she wasn't sure yet where his line was. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said. "Garrick," he said, "you've been here 3 weeks. The mister makes me feel like I'm in trouble." She almost smiled. "Garrick, then." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked around the classroom. At the patched roof, the new windows, the books on the shelves that hadn't been there when the month began, the chalk equations still on the board from the afternoon session. "It looks like a school," he said. It sounded like something more, but she wasn't sure what. "It is one," she said. He nodded. He picked up the empty crate. And then, at the door, he paused without quite turning around. "They're saying in town you're planning evening sessions for adults," he said. "Word travels." "It does." A beat. "Who's going?" "Mabel Griggs, maybe 2 others. We'll see." He was quiet for a moment. "Emmett Cross's daughter, Adeline. She's been coming?" "Every day," Vivian said. "She's extraordinarily capable. She should be in a real school, an academy, somewhere with resources to—" She caught herself. "She's doing very well." Garrick turned that over. "Cross won't be happy about you putting those ideas in her head." "What ideas?" "That she ought to go somewhere better." Vivian met his eyes. She deserves to know what's possible. What she does with that information is her own business. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense that he was revising something, some initial assessment he'd made and was now finding insufficient. "Good night, Vivian," he said. She noted that he'd used her first name without asking. She decided she didn't mind. "Good night, Garrick," she said. The first time she heard about the cattle raiders, it was from Tommy Prentice, who heard it from his father, who had heard it at the saloon on a Saturday night and came home talking too loud about things that scared him. Tommy relayed the information the following Monday with the particular combination of fear and excitement that 11-year-olds bring to things that haven't touched them personally yet. "Pa says somebody hit the Laramie Valley Ranchers last month," he said, leaning across his desk to talk to Daniel. "Took 60 head. Just took them. In the night." "Laramie's far," Daniel said. "Pa says they're moving north." Vivian heard this from the front of the room and said nothing, but she filed it. She asked Cutter about it that evening, coming back from the school. He was mending harness in front of the barn, and he didn't look up when she asked, which she'd already learned meant he was thinking about how much to say. "It's been quiet here," he said finally, "but the Laramie business was real. 3 ranches, organized like they knew the layout beforehand, someone with inside information or someone who'd done good scouting. Has Garrick heard about it?" "He has." "What does he think?" Cutter set the harness down and looked at her. He had a way of looking at people that reminded her of a doctor assessing something, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "He thinks what every rancher thinks when he hears something like that it probably won't come here, and if it does, he'll deal with it." He paused. "He's been wrong about the first part before." Vivian nodded. She didn't press it. But that night, lying on the cot in the barn room, listening to the wind move through the valley, she thought about the unfinished house on the rise. She thought about what Garrick had said when she pointed to it, "Leave it," and the way he'd said it, like a door closing. She thought about what kind of man builds a house and then stops. She thought about what kind of loss does that to a person. She had her own losses. She understood, in the way that people who have carried grief understand each other, not through explanation, but through a kind of recognition, the way you can sometimes tell, in a crowded room, who else has been carrying something heavy for a long time. You could see it in the set of their shoulders. She had seen it in his. She turned over on the cot and pulled the blanket up against the cold. Temporary, she reminded herself. The wind said nothing useful in response. Emmett Cross came to the school on the 3rd week of October. He was not there as a parent expressing approval. He was a tall, angular man with the kind of grievance in him that had been cultivating for a long time, and he stood in the doorway of the schoolroom at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, with the students gone and Vivian straightening up, and he looked at the books on the shelves and the equations on the board and the stacks of student work on her desk with the expression of a man who has found something objectionable and is working up to saying so. "Mr. Cross," Vivian said, "Adeline did excellent work today. She's been—" "I didn't come about Adeline's work," Cross said. He had a hat in his hands and he was turning it, which she'd learned to recognize as a sign that someone was working hard to stay civil. "I came about ideas." "What ideas?" "She came home last Friday talking about academies, schools in the East, scholarships." He said the word like it had an unpleasant taste. "Told her mother she wanted to be a botanist." "She expressed interest in plant biology, yes," Vivian said carefully. "She's 15 years old," Cross said. "She's going to marry somebody with good land and raise her children and keep a house. That's her life. She doesn't need to know about botanists." The room was very quiet. Vivian set down what she was holding. She turned to face him fully. She was significantly smaller than Emmett Cross, and she was aware of this as a physical fact without being particularly interested in it as a strategic consideration. "Mr. Cross," she said, keeping her voice even, "Adeline is the most intellectually gifted student in this classroom. She understands concepts in an afternoon that most adults struggle with for weeks. It would be an extraordinary waste to—" "I didn't ask for your assessment of my daughter's intellect," Cross said. "No. But you walked into my school, so you're getting it." His jaw tightened. The hat revolved faster in his hands. "She's my daughter," he said, "and you're a teacher in a borrowed schoolroom on land that doesn't belong to you. And if I want her to stop coming here, she'll stop coming here." Vivian held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about the list of things she could say. She thought about tactics and diplomacy and the particular calculus of when to push and when to give ground strategically. "You're her father," she said finally. "That's true. And she loves you. She talks about you with real respect. But I want you to think about one thing before you make that decision." She paused. "In 10 years, when she's doing exactly what you've described, keeping a house, raising children, she's going to remember this year. She's going to remember whether she was allowed to find out what she was capable of. And you're going to remember whether you were the one who let her or the one who stopped her." Cross was silent. "She doesn't have to go anywhere," Vivian said, softer. "She can stay in Red Hollow and be extraordinary here. But she needs the chance to choose. That's all I'm giving her." Cross put his hat on. He turned toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "She's home by 4, he said. "Not a minute later." He left. Vivian let out a breath she had not been aware she was holding. She thought, not for the first time, that being a teacher required a particular kind of courage that had nothing to do with classrooms. She told Garrick about it at dinner that evening. She hadn't planned to. But Cutter asked how the school was going, and she'd mentioned Cross, and suddenly Garrick was paying close attention. "He came to the school," Garrick said. "He did." "What did he want?" "To tell me his daughter didn't need ideas." Something tightened in Garrick's face. "What did you say?" She told him, as accurately as she could. When she finished, Garrick was quiet for a moment. "That was brave," he said. "It was necessary," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it faded. "You and your differences," he said. "I have a lot of them. I find they matter." Cutter poured more coffee around the table and said nothing, which Vivian had come to understand was his way of signaling that he was listening carefully. Cross is a hard-headed man, Garrick said, but he loves his daughter. He just doesn't know how to show her that love in a way that doesn't look like offense. Vivian looked at him. That's a perceptive way to put it. I've known Emmett Cross for 30 years, Garrick said. I've seen him do the same thing with his cattle, his water rights, his workers. He holds on too tight because he's afraid of losing. He picked up his coffee cup. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable. You could talk to him, Vivian said. Garrick looked at her. And say what? That Adeline staying in school is good for Red Hollow, that educated people build better communities, that Emmett Cross doesn't care about Red Hollow's community, Garrick said. He cares about his land and his family. If you want to reach him, you talk about what's good for those. Then tell him that, she said, because you have standing with him that I don't. A pause. Garrick set down his cup. He looked at her with that level assessing look she was getting to know. You want me to advocate for your school, he said. I want you to advocate for Adeline Cross, she said. The school can take care of itself. Something moved across his face. Something that looked briefly like the beginning of something she couldn't name. I'll think about it, he said. She accepted that because she was learning that when Garrick Hale said he'd think about something, he usually meant he'd already decided and just needed a day to admit it. The evening wound down. Remy went out to finish some task he'd left undone. Cutter washed up. Garrick went back to his paperwork at the table, and Vivian sat for a while with the last of her coffee in the lamplight, thinking about a girl who wanted to be a botanist, and a man who had stopped building a house, and a valley that the wind came through too fast and too cold, and all the things in Red Hollow that were unfinished and waiting to be decided. She walked back to the barn under a sky full of stars, so thick they looked deliberate. She thought, I have been here less than a month. She thought, I am not leaving. It surprised her how certain that felt. Emmett Cross did not pull Adeline from the school. Garrick rode out to the Cross property on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after Vivian had told him about the confrontation, and he was back by noon. He didn't say much about it when he returned, just unsaddled his horse, hung up his coat, and told Cutter that Adeline Cross would be staying in school through the end of the year, at minimum. Cutter didn't ask what had been said. Remy, who had the self-preservation instincts of someone who'd been fired from 2 previous jobs for asking too many questions, also didn't ask. Vivian asked, she waited until dinner, and then she asked. Garrick looked at her across the table with the expression of a man deciding how much information constituted a reasonable answer. I told him the truth, he said. Which truth? That a daughter who can read a contract is harder to cheat than one who can't, and that the men in this valley would benefit from marrying women who understood the books. Vivian stared at him. That's how you convinced him. Emmett Cross speaks money, Garrick said, without apology. I spoke money. She wanted to be bothered by the pragmatism of it. She found that she wasn't entirely, which bothered her more. It worked, she said. It worked, he agreed, and went back to eating. Cutter was doing the thing where he looked at his plate very attentively while clearly following every word, and Vivian decided she would address that some other time or possibly never. Some things in a shared household were better left companionably unacknowledged. November arrived and brought a cold that was different in kind from October's cold. Less a chill and more a commitment, the kind that moved into your bones and indicated it planned to stay until April. The mountains to the west disappeared behind cloud cover that settled in and didn't lift for weeks. The creek at the bottom of the valley went gray and slow. The cottonwood trees that stood at the south edge of Garrick's property had dropped everything they had and stood bare and skeletal against the white sky, and Vivian, walking past them each morning on her way to town, thought they were more beautiful without their leaves than with, more honest maybe, about what they actually were. The school had 21 students by the middle of November. 2 of them were 9 years old. One was 16 and came reluctantly, under orders from an aunt who had decided that ignorance was a social liability. Mabel Griggs came on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and she had brought 2 women with her, a widow named Frances Holt, who wanted to read her late husband's letters properly, and a young Mexican woman named Rosaria Vega, whose husband worked at Garrick's ranch, and who had been teaching herself English from a hymnal for 2 years and was, as Vivian discovered, frighteningly quick. The hymnal, Rosaria explained carefully, had a limited vocabulary. What did you want to learn that the hymnal didn't have? Vivian asked. Rosaria thought about it. Arguments, she said. How to win them in English. Vivian added her to the advanced reading group immediately. The school was functioning, more than functioning. It had taken on a kind of momentum that Vivian recognized from the best years of her teaching in Connecticut. That particular quality of a classroom that's figured out it wants to learn. She could feel it in the way students stayed a few minutes past the end of the day, or came in early, or brought her things they'd found that they wanted explained. A strange rock, a paragraph in the Billings newspaper about something happening in Washington, a mathematical puzzle that Tommy Prentice had apparently invented himself and was very smug about. She was happy, in the specific way she was happy when useful work was going well. She was also, in a quieter and less examined part of herself, increasingly aware that she had been sleeping in Garrick Hale's barn for 6 weeks, and that this had become, without her quite intending it, something that felt like home. That was a problem. She knew it was a problem. She was not sure yet how large a problem it was. The letter from Boston arrived on a Thursday. It came addressed to Vivian Alder Mercer, her full name, which nobody in Red Hollow knew, and it had been forwarded twice, first from an address in Connecticut she'd left 8 months ago, and then from Billings, and it showed the wear of that journey in its crumpled corners and the way the ink had smeared slightly on the outside from being carried in weather. The return address was a law office on Beacon Street. Amos Pickard handed it to her across the telegraph counter with the particular expressionless face of a man who had read the return address and was very deliberately not commenting on it. She took it home, to the barn, she corrected herself, and sat on the cot and held it for a long moment without opening it. She knew what it was. She had been expecting it, in the way you expect something you've been avoiding, with the knowledge that avoidance only delays rather than prevents. It was the third letter from the Alder family's attorneys since her husband Thomas had died 14 months ago. The first 2 she had answered through her own lawyer in New Haven. Apparently that had not been satisfactory. She opened it. The language was careful and legal, and it took her 2 readings to strip it down to what it actually said, which was this. Her late husband's estate, modest as it was, had been settled. But her own family's interests, specifically the trust established by her grandfather Cornelius Alder, of which she was a beneficiary, required her attention and, increasingly, her physical presence. Her uncle, who managed the family's considerable business holdings, had been patient. He was, the letter implied with exquisite courtesy, running out of patience. At the bottom, in handwriting rather than type, was a note from the attorney himself, a man named Whitfield who had known her since she was 12. Vivian, your uncle is not a patient man, as you know. He has legal avenues. Please come home before he feels compelled to use them. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to where she could feel its presence as a persistent reminder. She sat for a while in the cold afternoon light coming through the barn room's west window. She had not talked about Boston to anyone in Red Hollow. She had not talked about the Alder family, or the trust, or the fact that the name on that letter, Alder, was the name of one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Massachusetts, a family she had spent the better part of her adult life quietly and carefully stepping away from. Thomas had understood. He had loved her partially because she had chosen a small life over a large fortune, and he had found that choice as incomprehensible as he found it admirable. The problem with inheriting money from people who don't want you to have independence is that the money comes attached to them. She went to dinner at the main house. She was quieter than usual, and she was aware of being quieter than usual, and she was aware that Garrick had noticed but was not asking, and she appreciated the not asking even as it made her feel worse about what she wasn't saying. After dinner, Cutter and Remy went out to check on something in the north pasture, and Vivian was helping clear the table, a habit she'd fallen into without either of them discussing it, the way you fall into habits in shared spaces, when Garrick said from the other side of the table, "Bad news?" She looked up. "You've been carrying something since you got here tonight," he said. "Not my business, but I'm asking." She set down the plate she was holding. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about Beacon Street and the Alder name and everything that name had meant to her life for 32 years. The way it had shaped and constrained and occasionally smothered her in the particular gentle way of families who believed they knew what was best for you and had the resources to enforce that belief. "A letter," she said, "from lawyers." Your husband's estate? Related. She paused. She looked at the table, which was easier than looking at him. I have family in Boston. I've been at a distance from them, by choice, for some time. They want me to come back. Do you want to go back? No, Sal, she said without hesitation, and the certainty of it surprised her, even though it shouldn't have. Garrick was quiet for a moment. Then don't. It's not entirely that simple. It never is, he said. But usually the complicated parts are things other people added. What you want is the simple part. She looked at him. He was leaning against the wall beside the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, not relaxed exactly. Garrick Hale was not a man who relaxed fully, she had learned, but settled in the way he always was, like something that had decided where it stood and was comfortable there. You make it sound like it's only about want, she said. Isn't most of it? There are obligations. There are also exits, he said. People don't always use them. She thought about that for a moment. Is that what you did? After... She stopped. She had been about to say after your wife died, and she caught herself because she had not been told directly about Clara. She had pieced it together from small things, from a name mentioned once by Cutter and then not again, from the way Garrick's hands went still sometimes in the middle of a sentence about something unrelated, from the unfinished house on the rise that nobody was allowed to mention. After what? He said. His voice was even. After whatever it was that stopped you from finishing the house, she said carefully. The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her for a long time, and she held the look because she'd started this, and walking it back now would be its own kind of disrespect. His expression didn't close. It didn't slam shut the way some people's did when you touch something too close. It just became very still, the way water goes still right before something moves beneath it. Her name was Clara, he said. My wife. She died 6 years ago. Her and the baby both. I'm sorry, Vivian said. It was inadequate, but most things were. The house was supposed to be hers, he said. She wanted something bigger than this one, something with a proper parlor and a room for the children she wanted to have. I started building it the year before she died. He stopped. I got the framing up. She died in February. By spring, I couldn't figure out what the point was. He said it flat, without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with feeling, because the flatness meant it had been said to himself so many times it had worn smooth. 6 years of a grief that had calcified into a building with no walls and no roof standing on a hill that he could see from his kitchen window every morning. Do you still see her in it? Vivian asked. The house? I don't look at it. You see it. A beat. Yes. She wanted to say something useful. She had spent 30 years in various states of loss. Her mother at 19, 2 pregnancies that didn't hold, Thomas, and she knew, better than most, that useful things were rarer than they seemed. So instead she said something true. The looking away doesn't make it smaller, she said. It just means it gets to be a certain size without you ever checking. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd gone too far. Then he said, low and a little rough, no, it doesn't. She picked up the plates again. She carried them to the basin. She heard him push off the wall and move, and then he was beside her at the basin, not touching, just present, and they did the washing up in silence that was different from the earlier silences. Not the absence of something, but the presence of it, something that had been named and was now just sitting there between them being what it was. When she left for the barn that night, he walked with her to the door, something he'd never done before, and stood in the light from inside while she went out into the dark, and she could feel him standing there until she was out of sight. She did not let herself think about what that meant, or rather, she thought about it for the entire walk across the yard, and the entire time she was getting ready for bed, and most of the time she lay awake afterward, listening to the horses shift and breathe in the dark. And she told herself firmly that it meant nothing particular, and she was a practical woman and she had a school to run. The wind agreed and disagreed in equal measure. Cutter Walsh had a way of appearing at useful moments that Vivian had initially thought was coincidence and eventually decided was deliberate. He appeared at the school the following Saturday morning. Not a school day, Vivian was there alone reorganizing the book supply, and leaned in the doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hands and said, "You mind company?" "Come in," she said. He came in and sat on one of the student desks, A piece of furniture clearly not designed for a 52-year-old man with bad knees, but he made it work through sheer stubbornness and looked around the room the way he always looked at things, thoroughly and without hurry. "You heard about the Billingsworth Ranch," he said. It was not quite a question. She had. The news had come in 2 days ago. A ranch 40 miles south, 600 head of cattle taken in a single night by a group of men organized enough to hit 3 separate pastures simultaneously. The rancher, a man named Billingsworth she didn't know, had tried to stop them and was currently in a doctor's care in Billings with a broken collarbone and considerably less cattle than he'd started the week with. "I heard," she said. "Is Garrick concerned?" "He's planning," Cutter said, which she was beginning to understand meant yes, significantly. "He's been talking to the other ranchers, Drummond, the Prentice boy's father, a couple others, trying to work out a watch schedule for the winter." "That seems sensible." "It is sensible." Cutter turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture Emmett Cross had made in this room, she noticed, though in Cutter it came from thought rather than agitation. "Problem is, some of the smaller ranchers are scared enough that they're thinking about selling and leaving, which is likely what whoever's doing this wants." "Why would they want that?" "Consolidate the valley," Cutter said simply. "You buy up scared ranchers cheap, you end up with a lot of land for not much money. Somebody's running a business here. It's not just theft." Vivian stopped what she was doing. She looked at him. "You think someone specific is behind it, someone with resources." "Garrick thinks it. He doesn't say it out loud because he doesn't have proof, and that man does not make accusations he can't back up." Cutter looked at her carefully. "He also doesn't say it because he doesn't want to scare people worse than they already are, but he's watching." She understood that she was being told something, and she understood that Cutter was telling it to her for a reason, and she appreciated him enough to ask directly. "Why are you telling me?" "Because you're sharp," Cutter said, without flattery, just assessment. "And because you see things about people that Garrick misses. Because Garrick is too busy looking at the problem to look at the people around it." He stood up from the desk with a wince he tried to conceal and failed. "And because whatever you've got going on with that letter from Boston," she went very still. "I'm not prying," Cutter said. "Amos Pickard talks, and small towns listen. I'm just saying, if there's something coming from that direction that might complicate things here, it would be useful to know about before it becomes a problem." He put his hat on. "That's all." He left before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. Cutter Walsh was a man who made his point and then gave you room to sit with it, and she was irritated by how effective a strategy she found this. She sat down in the teacher's chair and looked at the bookshelves and the chalkboard and the 21 students' worth of work stacked on the corner desk, and she thought about what it would mean for something from Boston to arrive in Red Hollow, and whether arriving meant the kind of arriving that knocked politely or the kind that didn't knock at all. Her uncle, she knew, was not a patient man. She wrote back to Attorney Whitfield that evening. She kept it short. She said she was settled in Montana and intended to remain settled in Montana, and that the trust could wait another season, and she thanked him for his concern and asked him to communicate this to her uncle in whatever diplomatic language he felt was appropriate. She was aware, sealing the envelope, that she was buying time rather than solving anything. She was also aware that she was doing it because she didn't want to leave, and that the reasons for not wanting to leave had become, over the past 6 weeks, considerably more complicated than a school and a collection of books. December's first snow came on a Tuesday night while she was at the main house for dinner, and it came in earnest. Not the testing, preliminary snowfall of late October, but real snow, committed snow, the kind that fell for 6 hours and left 8 inches on the ground and turned the world outside the windows into a uniform gray-white silence. They heard it start while they were still at the table, the sound of wind picking up and the dry whisper of flakes against the window glass. And Remy went to look and said, "Well, winter." Nobody argued with this. After dinner, Garrick walked her to the barn. He'd started doing this, not saying anything about it, just putting on his coat when she got up to leave and walking with her. She had stopped pretending she found this unremarkable about 4 evenings in. The snow was deep enough now to come over the tops of her boots, and she was concentrating on where to put her feet, and he was walking beside her with a lantern because the clouds had covered the stars and the yard was properly dark. Their breath showed white in the lantern light. The snow coming down made everything quiet in that way that snow does. not the absence of sound, but a softening of it, like the world wrapping itself in something thick. "The road to town will be rough tomorrow," he said. "I'll manage." "I'm not saying you won't. I'm saying I'll have Remy hitch the sleigh in the morning and he can take you in." He paused. "If you want." "That's... yes. Thank you." They walked for a moment in the snow's particular silence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You'll ask it either way." That was true enough. "Why did you build the house up on the rise instead of closer to the main house?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Clara wanted to see the whole valley from the front porch. From down here you only get half of it. From up there you see it all. Both ranges, the creek, the whole floor of the valley from south to north." He paused. "She said it would make every morning feel like something." "It would," Vivian said. "I've stood up there. The view is..." She stopped, because she'd done it without thinking about it, one morning weeks ago, walked up to look, and she hadn't mentioned it because she hadn't been sure how he'd feel about someone standing in the middle of his unfinished grief. "I know," he said quietly. "You saw me. I see most of what happens on this property." She didn't know what to say to that. They reached the barn door. He held the lantern up so she could see to open it, and she put her hand on the latch, and then she turned and looked at him in the orange light, snowflakes coming down between them and catching the glow for a second before they didn't. "Garrick," she said. "Vivian." The way he said her name, not casually, not the way people say names when they're just using them, made something in her chest do a thing she actively chose not to analyze in the moment. "What are you going to do if they come here?" she asked. "The raiders." He looked at her steadily. "Protect what's mine," he said. "And what is yours?" A pause that lasted a beat too long to be casual. "The land," he said. "The cattle. The people on this ranch." Another pause. "Red Hollow." She nodded. She went inside. She heard him stand there for a moment in the snow before his footsteps crunched back toward the main house. She sat on the cot in her coat for a long time before she remembered to take it off. The next morning, Remy drove her to town in the sleigh as promised, and the valley was white and tremendous and absolutely silent, and she sat beside Remy under a wool blanket and watched Red Hollow come into view at the bottom of the road, the thin smoke from chimneys rising straight up in the cold air, and she thought about what it meant to call a place yours. She had called places hers before, a townhouse in New Haven that she and Thomas had rented for 8 years, where she knew the sound of every floorboard and the way the kitchen light fell in winter mornings. A room in Boston she'd grown up in, full of books, and the memory of her mother and the particular tension of a family that loved and controlled in equal proportion. This was different. This was something she hadn't chosen so much as arrived in, and it had arranged itself around her while she wasn't paying attention, and now she was looking at it and realizing she didn't want to arrange herself out of it. "Mrs. Mercer?" Remy said. "Sorry. Thinking." "We're here." He was looking at the school, and then at something beyond it, a rider coming down Main Street at a pace that suggested news rather than routine, and news in the cold on horseback in Red Hollow in December was rarely the comfortable kind. It was Daniel Prentice's older brother, not Daniel, but a young man she'd seen around, maybe 17, and he pulled up in front of the general store and shouted for anyone who could hear him, and what he shouted was that the Drummond Ranch, 8 miles northwest, had been hit in the night. Vivian sat in the sleigh and watched Red Hollow receive this information the way a body receives a blow. First the stillness, then the movement, people coming out of buildings, conversations starting, voices rising. Harlan Briggs stepped out of the general store. Mabel Griggs appeared from the laundry. 2 ranch hands she didn't know came out of the saloon pulling their coats on. Remy looked at her. "I should get back," he said. "Tell Mr. Hale." "Go," she said. She climbed down from the sleigh. "Tell him I'm in town. Tell him to send word if he needs anything." Remy turned the horse and went, and Vivian stood in the snow in the middle of Main Street and watched a small town recalibrate around news it had been dreading, and she thought about what Cutter had said. Someone's running a business here. And she thought about the unfinished house on the hill, and about a man who had decided what was his. She opened the school an hour early. It seemed like the right thing to do. Not because the children needed a lesson, but because in her experience, the right place to be when the ground underneath a community starts to shift is somewhere solid, somewhere that announces by its presence that not everything is in motion. She lit the stove, unlocked the door, and put water on to heat. And within 20 minutes, she had 7 students and 3 adults sitting in the warm room doing nothing in particular but being together, which was, she had always believed, an underrated human activity. She taught that afternoon as if nothing had changed, because something about normalcy is its own form of courage. She taught fractions and the water cycle and how to write a letter with proper address lines. And when Tommy Prentice asked her if the bad men were going to come to Red Hollow, she looked at him steadily and said, "There are good people here who are going to make sure that doesn't happen. Your job is to learn. Let them do theirs." Tommy seemed to find this satisfactory. Garrick arrived at the school at 4 o'clock, just after the students had gone. He came through the door in his heavy coat, snow on his shoulders, and looked at her across the empty room. "You heard," he said. "This morning," she said. "Drummond? Hit hard. 140 head. His youngest son has a cut on his arm. Tried to stop them, which was stupid. He's all right." He came further into the room, pulled off his gloves, looked at the dying fire in the stove. "I've been to see Drummond, then Prentice Sr., then 2 others. We're setting up watches starting tonight." "Cutter told me you suspected this was organized," she said. "Someone directing it." He looked at her sharply. "Cutter talks too much." "Cutter talks exactly the right amount to the right people," she said. "Do you know who?" "No." He said it with the particular weight of someone who had a suspicion and was not yet ready to name it. "Not yet." She looked at him. The afternoon light was going, and the schoolroom was getting dim, and he was standing in the middle of it with the kind of contained energy that she recognized as a man keeping himself steady because steadiness was required. "Garrick, I'm not going to let them take this valley," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was something quieter and more serious than that. A statement of intention that had the weight of a decision already made. Whatever it takes. She believed him. That was the thing. She believed him completely, not because of his land or his resources or the fact that he was physically imposing, but because of the specific quality of his stillness when he said it, the way someone sounds when they are telling you something true about themselves. She crossed the room and put her hand on the stove, warm, barely, and said, "Let me help." "This isn't... School is the center of a community," she said. "If people are frightened, they come here. If they need to talk, they come here. If you want Red Hollow to hold together through whatever's coming, the school stays open and it stays full, and it stays the thing in this town that isn't afraid." She looked at him. "Let me do that." He looked back at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. She nodded once. "Come to dinner," he said. "It's cold." She locked the school and walked out into the early dark beside him, and the snow was coming down again, softer this time, and Red Hollow lay quiet around them on all sides, tucked into the valley between the mountains with the creek moving gray beneath the ice at its edges. And she thought, "I am not leaving. Whatever comes from Boston or from the hills to the north, I am not leaving this." It felt for the first time in a long time like solid ground. The watch schedule held through the first 2 weeks of December without incident, which Garrick said was either good luck or bad news wearing a patient face. He leaned toward the second interpretation. A man who had run cattle through enough hard seasons understood that quiet before a storm was still part of the storm. He organized the watches the way he organized everything, methodically, without drama, assigning men to shifts and pastures with the same efficiency he applied to any logistical problem. Cutter took the north perimeter. Remy and 2 other hands rotated the east pasture where the bulk of the herd grazed. Prentice Sr. sent 2 of his own men to cover the ridge trail that connected the valley ranches, which was the most logical approach route for anyone moving livestock in numbers. Garrick himself took the late watch, midnight to 4, because he slept badly anyway and had for 6 years, and he might as well put the wakefulness to use. Vivian found out about the midnight watch from Cutter because Garrick hadn't mentioned it. "How long has he been doing that?" she asked. "Since Drummond got hit," Cutter said. "He was oiling a saddle in the barn and didn't look up. Before that, on and off. He doesn't sleep much. Never did. Even before..." He stopped. Even after a while. She understood the pause. After Clara. Everything in Garrick's life seemed to organize itself around that fault line, before and after, with the fault running directly through an unfinished house on a hill. She started leaving coffee on the stove before she went to bed. She didn't say anything about it. She just made sure the fire was banked enough to keep it warm and the pot was full. And in the morning, she could tell by the level whether he'd found it. He never mentioned it either, but one morning she came out of the barn room to find a cut of firewood stacked beside her door. Good dry wood, split fine for a small stove. And she understood that they had arrived, without discussing it, at a kind of language that didn't use words. This was both the most comfortable and the most alarming development of the past 2 months, and she was aware of both qualities simultaneously. The second letter from Boston arrived on the 14th of December, and this one was not from Attorney Whitfield. It was from her uncle directly. His name was Leonard Alder, and he was 64 years old and had run the Alder family's financial interests for 30 years, with the conviction of a man who believed that money, properly managed, was the closest thing to permanence that the world offered. He was not cruel. He had never been cruel to her, not exactly. What he was, with great consistency and considerable skill, was certain that he knew what was best, certain that the family's collective interests were more important than individual preferences, certain that Vivian's choice to marry a schoolteacher and live modestly in New Haven had been a charming eccentricity that she would eventually outgrow. The letter was 4 pages, which was 4 pages more than Whitfield's had been, and it covered several subjects with the thoroughness of a man who had prepared his argument carefully. It covered the trust, which was larger than Vivian had allowed herself to think about clearly, her grandfather having been the kind of industrialist that the Gilded Age produced in quantity. It covered the family's expectation that she would return to Boston and take her appropriate role in managing those interests now that Thomas was gone. It covered, in language that was polite but structurally a threat, what the legal options were should she continue to decline. And then, in the last paragraph, it said something that made her sit down on the cot with the letter in her hand and stay there for a long time. I am also given to understand, through parties who have had occasion to observe your situation in the Montana Territory, that you have established yourself in an arrangement with a local rancher that, whatever its practical merits, raises certain questions of propriety that the family cannot ignore indefinitely. I trust you understand that the Alder name carries obligations that do not diminish with distance. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the letter down and sat very still and thought about what it meant that her uncle had someone watching her. Not hypothetically, not as a general concern, specifically. Someone who had reported back on her living situation, on Garrick, on the arrangement with enough detail for Leonard Alder to characterize it as a matter of propriety. She was angry. It arrived slowly, the way real anger does when it's the serious kind rather than the quick, hot kind. Building from the bottom up, from something cold and certain into something she had to consciously keep from showing on her face when she came to dinner. She managed dinner. She was distracted, and she knew it, but she kept the conversation moving, and she ate, and she answered Remy's question about something he'd read in the newspaper, and she told Cutter about Rosaria Vega's progress with English, which was genuinely impressive and deserved to be told. Garrick watched her the way he always watched her when something was off. Not intrusively, just attentive, tracking the difference between who she was on ordinary evenings and who she was being right now. He waited until Cutter and Remy had gone before he said anything. "The letter again," he said. Not a question. She put her coffee cup down. She had been deciding, through the entire meal, how much to say and to whom to say it, and she had arrived at a conclusion that felt both necessary and frightening, which usually meant it was the right one. "My family name is not Mercer," she said. My married name is Mercer. My family name is Alder." She watched him process this without visible reaction, which was one of his qualities she found alternately admirable and frustrating. "The Alders," he said. "Massachusetts. You know the name. Any man who reads a financial newspaper knows the name." He looked at her steadily. "You're Leonard Alder's niece." "His brother's daughter, yes." She folded her hands on the table. "My father died when I was 15. My uncle became my guardian. He is a man who cares in his way, but his way involves a great deal of management. And you left. I married Thomas Mercer when I was 22, which my uncle considered an act of rebellion, which it partly was and partly wasn't. Thomas was a good man. The fact that he taught school and had no money was, for my uncle, a kind of personal affront." She paused. "When Thomas died last year, my uncle saw it as an opportunity. Not maliciously. He genuinely believes he knows what's best for me." "What does he want?" For me to come back to Boston, take a role in managing the family's business interests, marry someone appropriate. She said this last part with a flatness that conveyed clearly what she thought of it. There is a trust, my grandfather's. It's substantial. My uncle controls it until I either marry someone he approves of or reach 35, which is in 3 years. And if you don't go back? He has lawyers, she said, and the lawyers have tools. Whether any of those tools would actually work against someone who simply declines to participate is, honestly, uncertain. But the process of finding out would be disruptive and expensive and public in ways I've been trying to avoid. Garrick was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table and she could see him thinking, not reacting, thinking, which was another quality she had come to trust. He knows you're here, he said. He has someone watching, she said. The letter implies it. He mentioned our arrangement. She met his eyes. He used the word propriety. Something moved in Garrick's face. Not anger exactly. Something harder and less negotiable than anger. Someone in Red Hollow, he said. Or someone who came through. I don't know. She kept her voice even. I'm sorry. I should have told you who I was earlier. I didn't because The name comes with things I've spent years putting distance from, and I was afraid that telling people would bring those things here. It brought them here anyway. It did. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she felt the cold of it, not hostility, but the particular weight of something being reconsidered. I'm not angry at you, he said finally. I'd have made the same choice. He looked up. But I need to know the rest of it, all of it. If someone is in this valley reporting back to Leonard Alder, that affects more than just you. She told him everything. She told him about the trust and the legal structure her uncle had built around it, and about Whitfield and the letters, and about the specific language in the paragraph about propriety that told her someone had been close enough to observe her living situation in detail. She told him about her father, and about the choice she'd made at 22, and about Thomas, and about what it had cost her to walk away from a fortune and a family name and build a life that was hers on a teacher's salary in Connecticut. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him, the quality of his attention, the sense that he was actually taking in what she said rather than loading his response while she spoke. When she finished, he said, "You're not going back." "No." "And you're not letting him use the trust as a lever." "I am actively figuring out how to prevent that." He nodded slowly. "There's a lawyer in Billings named Hargrove," he said. "He's good. Better than good. He's the man you want if you're fighting someone with Boston money, because he's beaten Boston money before and he enjoyed it." He paused. "I can introduce you." "I'll pay my own legal fees," she said immediately. "I know you will," he said, without a trace of the implication she'd been guarding against. "I'm introducing you to a lawyer, not paying for your fight. Those are different things." She almost smiled despite herself. "I know," she said. There was a silence, not uncomfortable, but full of everything that had been said and the weight of it settling. "Vivian," he said. She looked at him. "The person reporting to your uncle," he said. "I have a suspicion. I don't want to say it until I'm sure, but when I'm sure, I'll tell you." "Tell me the suspicion now." "No," he said. And it was so simply said that she found she couldn't argue with it. "Because if I'm wrong, I'll have put something in your head that isn't true, and that's worse." She accepted that. She didn't like it, but she accepted it. She went back to the barn that night through the cold, and she lay on the cot in the dark listening to the horses and thinking about what it meant that she had told him. She had not told anyone, Otto, not Cutter, not Mabel, not any of the friends she'd left behind in Connecticut. The full shape of who she was and where she came from and what she'd been running from in the pleasant, civilized, unyielding way of wealthy families. She had told Garrick Hale in a ranch house kitchen in Montana, and he had said, "You're not going back," as though it were an established fact, and the certainty of it had felt, inexplicably, like being handed something solid to stand on. She understood, lying there in the dark, that she was in serious trouble of the emotional variety, and that it was probably too late to do much about it. The trouble arrived with the name 4 days later. His name was Preston Wald, and he came to Red Hollow in a good coat and a rented horse from Billings, and he said he was a land assessor looking into property values in the valley for a client who was considering investment in Montana ranching. He was smooth in the way of men who had practiced smoothness until it became reflex, with a smile that reached exactly far enough and stopped. He stayed at what remained of Red Hollow's accommodation situation. Widow Hadley had 2 spare rooms she let out when pressed, and he asked questions in the saloon and the general store with the casualness of someone who was very good at not appearing to ask questions. Garrick told Vivian about Wald on the second day, when he came by the school at midday, while the students were outside in the brief cold sunshine, arguing about something involving a stick and unclear rules. "Land assessor," she said. "No land assessor comes to a valley this size in December," Garrick said. "This is an assessment season. Nobody buys Montana Range in winter." "You think he's connected to the raids?" "I think he's connected to something." He watched the children through the window for a moment. Tommy Prentice had the stick now and was using it to defend himself against what appeared to be a coordinated attack from 3 other students, or to someone who's interested in this valley in ways that don't fit the story he's telling. "Or to my uncle," she said. He looked at her. "That occurred to me." "Both could be true." Yes. She thought about that, about the possibility that the raids and her uncle occupied the same territory in some way she couldn't fully see yet. It felt like too neat a connection, the kind of thing that sounds like paranoia until it turns out to be accurate. "What are you going to do about him?" she asked. "Watch him," Garrick said. "Same thing I do with everything I don't understand yet. Watch and wait, and don't show what I know." She nodded. She believed in this method herself. Observation before action, patience over urgency. But she found it harder to practice now than she used to, when what was at stake was more abstract than a school full of children and a valley full of people she had come to know. What happened next came from the direction she was watching least. Adeline Cross appeared at the schoolhouse door at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, 2 hours after the adult session had ended and Vivian was alone grading written work by lamplight. The girl was flushed from cold and something else, something around her eyes that suggested she had been crying, or was very close to it. "Adeline," Vivian said immediately. "Come in. What happened?" Adeline came in and stood in the middle of the room with her coat still on, and she looked like someone trying to hold herself together through the force of deliberate effort. "That man," she said, "the assessor." Vivian stood up. "Wald. He came to my father's house today," Adeline said. "He sat in our parlor and drank coffee and talked to my father about the ranch, about what it was worth and what a fair price might be." Her voice was steady but thin, like wire pulled too tight. "My father wasn't interested. He said so. But the man kept talking. He said the valley was going to change whether the ranchers cooperated or not, and that people who sold early got better prices than people who waited." "What did your father say?" "He told him to leave." Adeline's jaw tightened. "The man left. But then my father came and told me to stop coming to school." She looked at Vivian directly, and there was something in it that was not a girl asking for help, but a young woman making a decision and wanting a witness for it. "He said it was a distraction, that I needed to be at home, focused on what was real." Vivian looked at her for a moment. This girl with her serious eyes and her wanting to understand the water cycle and her plans that her father didn't know how to love without trying to contain. She thought about Emmett Cross sitting across from her in this room weeks ago, turning his hat in his hands. "What do you want, Adeline?" she asked. "I want to keep coming to school," Adeline said. "And I want to know that my father and his ranch are going to be all right because he's scared, and when he's scared, he makes bad decisions." Vivian put on her coat. "Come with me," she said. They walked to the Hale Ranch through the cold dark, and Vivian sent Adeline to sit with Cutter in the kitchen while she told Garrick what had happened. He listened with the focused stillness that meant he was assembling something in his mind, and when she finished, he said, "Wald went to Cross today." "Yes. He went to Drummond yesterday," Garrick said. "Drummond told me when I rode out to check on the watch rotation." He was standing, and now he reached for his coat. "If he's working the valley systematically, he's mapping who's scared enough to sell," Vivian said, "and who to report back to." He paused, and something in his expression confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that the suspicion he'd declined to share with her was no longer just a suspicion. "Vivian, I think your uncle is the client." She stood very still. "The land acquisition," he said, "the pressure on small ranchers, The cattle raids creating fear that softens people up for low offers. It's a strategy, and it requires capital and patience and connections. Leonard Alder has all three. He watched her. And he already has a reason to want you out of Montana. If the valley becomes his investment, your choices here become considerably narrower. The pieces of it assembled in her mind with the cold mechanical clarity of things that were obviously true once you could see them from the right angle. Her uncle, who believed that distance was temporary and management was inevitable, had not simply sent letters. He had sent money, direction, and a man in a good coat to a Montana valley to acquire land, and in doing so, acquire the circumstances of her life. He wouldn't, she said, and even as she said it, she knew she was wrong, not about his cruelty, but about his particular brand of love, the kind that couldn't distinguish between caring for someone and controlling the world around them. He would, Garrick said, not unkindly. Not to hurt you, to bring you home. In his mind, there's probably not much difference. She sat down heavily on the kitchen chair that had become, over months, her chair. The particular way she'd placed it at a slight angle, the specific spot where the lamplight was best for reading. Her chair in someone else's kitchen, in a life she had built out of determination and a trunk full of books in a town she'd arrived in as a stranger. "What do we do?" she asked. "Tonight? Nothing." Garrick pulled on his coat. "Tonight I'm going to ride to 3 ranches and tell them what Wald is and who he's probably working for. Tomorrow I'll send a wire to a contact in Boston who can confirm the connection between Wald and your uncle's investment operation. And then we'll know what we're dealing with before we decide how to deal with it." "And Adeline?" He paused. "Adeline Cross can come to school," he said. "I'll talk to Emmett. You already talked to Emmett once on her behalf." "I'll talk to him again," he said, and the flatness of it suggested that this time the conversation would be shorter and more direct than the first. He looked at her. "Will you be all right tonight?" She looked up at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway in his coat and his hat, ready to ride out in the December cold to do the things that needed doing, because that was how he was made. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just with the steady commitment of someone who had decided what was his and intended to protect it. "I'll be fine," she said. "I know you will," he said. "That's not what I asked." She met his eyes. "No," she said honestly. "Not entirely." He crossed the room. He did something he had not done before. He put his hand on the side of her face, brief and careful, just for a moment, and she felt the roughness of his palm and the warmth of it against her cold cheek, and then he stepped back. "I'll be back before morning," he said. He went out. She heard the horse in the yard, and then the sound of hooves on the frozen ground fading toward the road, and then nothing but the wind and the fire and the stove, and Adeline's voice in the kitchen asking Cutter something about fence-line geometry, because Adeline Cross was the kind of person who absorbed knowledge regardless of circumstance. Vivian sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and her hands in her lap, and the weight of what was coming settling around her like the snow that was starting again outside the window. And she thought about how strange it was, the way life could go from unmoored to anchored without you ever noticing the exact moment the line caught. She thought about a hand on her cheek in a cold kitchen. She thought about a man riding out in the dark to protect something. She thought, whatever comes from Boston, I am not leaving this. And this time, when she said it to herself, it wasn't just about the school. The wire came back from Boston in 36 hours. Garrick's contact there was a man named Foster Bain, a former land agent who had spent 20 years watching how Eastern money moved into Western territory, and who had made it his specific business to know the instruments through which that movement happened. Bain's reply was 2 sentences, which was all a wire needed to be when the facts were unambiguous. Alder Capital Partners, registered Delaware, acquired controlling interest in Western Territorial Land Trust, November 1884. Preston Wald is employed as regional acquisition agent. Garrick read it once, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went and found Cutter and told him, and Cutter said nothing for a long moment and then said, "So the raids and the woman are the same problem." "Connected problems," Garrick said. "Not the same." "Close enough," Cutter said. It was close enough. Leonard Alder had not personally organized cattle raids. Garrick was reasonably certain of that, because there was a distance between a Boston financier and frontier violence that even a determined man required intermediaries to cross. What Alder had done was simpler and in some ways more sophisticated. He had invested in a land acquisition operation that used fear as a softening agent, and the people running that operation had supplied the fear in whatever methods were available to them. The cattle raids were a business strategy. Red Hollow was a line item. And Vivian was what happened when your niece inconveniently built a life in the middle of your investment territory. He told her that evening. He laid it out the way he laid out any operational problem, clearly, without embellishment, with the facts in the order they mattered. She listened with her hands folded on the kitchen table and her expression doing the thing it did when she was angry and managing it, which was a tightening around the eyes that most people probably wouldn't notice. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He used the raids, she said, not directly, but he used them. The operation used them. Whether your uncle knew the specific methods or just the results, it doesn't matter, she said. He created the conditions. She looked at the table. I have spent my entire adult life trying to believe that he loved me in a limited way, rather than that he was simply unable to see past what he wanted. This makes that harder. Garrick didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say to that. What do we do? She asked. Second time she'd asked him that. He noticed she'd said we both times, and he felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as something that had been handed to him carefully and deserved to be held the same way. Two things at once, he said. The raids first, because people's livelihoods are at stake, and that can't wait. And your legal situation, you need to be in Boston before your uncle can move first, because a fight you choose is better than one that's forced on you. She looked up at him sharply. You want me to go to Boston. I want you to go to Boston on your terms, he said. Hargrove and Billings can brief you before you go. You walk in there having already structured the trust dispute the way you want it, not the way your uncle wants it. You take the offensive. He paused. And when it's done, you come back. She studied him. He held the look because he meant it, and he wanted that to be clear. You're certain I'll come back, she said. I'm certain you'll want to, he said. What you do about that is your own business. Something shifted in her expression, something that moved through and settled. When? She asked. After Christmas, he said. I need 2 weeks first to make sure the valley is secure enough that your leaving doesn't feel like an opportunity to anyone who's watching. She nodded. She accepted this the way she accepted most things he said when they were practical and true, without performance, just a steady acknowledgement. It was one of the things about her that had become, without his exactly deciding on it, essential to how he got through a day. He was aware of this. He was also aware that he had not yet figured out what to do with it, because the last time he had built something that mattered to him in that particular way, it had ended in February on a night he still could not think about directly, only around the edges. He went back to the work, which was what he always did with things he wasn't ready to examine. Preston Wald left Red Hollow on the 19th of December, which Garrick learned from Widow Hadley when he came into town on other business. Wald had paid his bill, thanked her for the accommodation, and ridden out north in the early morning without speaking to anyone. Garrick stood in front of Widow Hadley's and looked at the road north and thought about what north meant, and what it meant that Wald had gone without completing whatever survey he'd been conducting. It meant either that he'd gathered what he needed, or that something had changed his instructions. He found out which on Christmas Eve. He'd ridden the full perimeter of the ranch in the afternoon, checking on the watch rotation and making sure Cutter had everything organized for the overnight shift. And he was coming in from the south pasture in the fading light when he saw the smoke. It was the wrong color and the wrong direction. Not wood smoke from the chimneys, which was gray and thin, but something darker, thicker, coming from the east edge of the property where the winter hay storage was. He didn't stop to think. He turned the horse and rode. The hay barn was burning. By the time he reached it, the structure was already committed, flames moving through dried winter hay with the speed and indifference of something that has no preferences. It simply consumes. The heat hit him 40 feet out, and the horse shied, and he got down and tied her to a fence post and looked at the building and made the rapid calculation that there was nothing inside worth the risk of going in. The hay was gone. The building was going. What mattered now was containment. He shouted for anyone within range and got Remy within 2 minutes, who had seen it from the north pasture and come running. Between them and 2 other hands who arrived shortly after, they worked to wet down the fence line and the adjacent structure, a smaller equipment shed. and keep the fire from spreading to the main barn where the horses were. It took 2 hours. The hay barn was a total loss. The equipment shed survived with scorching on one wall. The horses were fine because they'd gotten to them early and moved them to the far corral. Garrick stood in front of the ruined building in the cold dark with ash on his coat and his hands and looked at what was left, which was not much, and thought about timing. Christmas Eve. Wald leaving 3 days prior. The watch schedule on the perimeters, which this fire had not been. It was interior, inside the property line, which meant either someone had come through the watch undetected or someone had been inside the property already. Cutter appeared at his shoulder. The hands are accounted for, he said, meaning he'd already checked. All of them. Someone got through the watch. Or someone we trusted, Cutter said, quiet and careful. Garrick turned that over. It was the version of the night that was worse. Not raiders from outside, but a more interior betrayal, someone with knowledge of the schedule and the layout. He looked at the ruined barn and felt the cold of it settle into him, not from the temperature, but from what the fire meant as a message. We can reach you inside your own defenses. He walked back to the main house. Vivian was in the kitchen when he came through the door, and she took one look at him, the ash, the expression, the set of his shoulders, and said nothing for a moment. Then she went to the stove and put more water on and said, "Sit down. I'm fine. You're covered in ash and you've been outside for 2 hours in December," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He was tired in the deep way that came not from physical effort, but from the accumulative weight of managing things, of holding a situation steady by force of attention and will, and always being the one who stood between whatever was coming and the people behind him. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands, which were dirty and had a small burn on the left palm that he hadn't noticed until now. Vivian put coffee in front of him. She saw the burn. She got a cloth and water and sat across from him and cleaned it without asking, with the business-like efficiency she brought to everything practical. She was not delicate about it. It was cold water on a burn, and it was not comfortable. But her hands were steady, and her attention was complete, and he watched her face while she worked and thought that this was one of the moments he would remember, probably, for a long time. "Tell me," she said, without looking up from his hand. He told her. The hay barn, the timing, the possibility of someone inside the watch. When he got to that part, she did look up. "Someone you know," she said. "Someone who knows this property," he said. "The layout of the watch, when the gaps are." He paused. "I've been going over who has that knowledge." "And?" "3 people outside my regular hands knew the full schedule," he said. "I shared it at the meeting last week with the other ranchers because it made sense to coordinate. Prentice, Drummond." He stopped. "And Cross," she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Vivian set down the cloth. She looked at him. "Emmett Cross wouldn't burn your barn. He has his grievances, but he's not—" "No," Garrick said, "not Emmett. But Emmett talks when he drinks, and he drinks when he's frightened, and Wald spent time at the saloon, and Emmett Cross spends time at the saloon, and frightened men say things they don't mean to say." He looked at his hand. "I'm not blaming Cross. I'm saying the information traveled, and I need to know where it went." She was quiet for a moment. "This escalates things," she said. "Yes. They're not just buying scared ranchers, they're creating scared ranchers. If Drummond sells, Prentice sells. If Prentice sells, Cross probably sells. Once you have 3 large properties in this valley, you can price the smaller ones out or just wait." He picked up the coffee. "And I'm the holdout, the one that doesn't scare." "So they're trying to scare you." "They burned a hay barn on Christmas Eve," he said. "They're trying to send a message. What message are you going to send back?" He looked at her across the table, and something in his expression must have been answer enough, because she nodded once, slowly, like someone who has understood something and is deciding what to do with the understanding. "I'm going to call a meeting," he said. "All the ranchers. In town, public, so Wald or whoever replaced him can see that we know what this is and we're not fragmenting." He set down the cup. "I need the town behind us, not just the ranchers, the merchants, the families. Everyone who has a reason to want Red Hollow to stay Red Hollow." "The school," she said. "The school," he agreed. "If you're willing." She looked at him steadily. "Use it however you need to." "Not the building," he said. You. People trust you. You've been here 4 months and you know this town better than men who've lived here 20 years because you actually looked at it. He paused, and the next part was harder to say but true. I can organize. I can lead. But I'm not the kind of man people want to sit with when they're frightened. I know that about myself. That's not... It's true, he said, without self-pity. I keep people safe. Cutter keeps them company. Different skills. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't quite name, something that held several things at once, affection and frustration, and something deeper that he was aware of not looking at directly, the way you avoid looking at something bright. All right, she said. Together, then. Together, he said. The meeting happened 3 days after Christmas, on a gray afternoon when the cold had settled in permanently, and the valley smelled like wood smoke and frozen ground. Vivian opened the school for it, and it was the largest gathering Red Hollow had seen in years. Every rancher in the valley, most of the merchants, half the town's residents, crowding into a classroom that had been built for 20 and was currently holding 60. Garrick stood at the front of the room and laid it out plainly. He named Wald, named the company, named the connection to Eastern Capital that was using fear as a land acquisition tool. He did not name Leonard Alder because he did not yet have proof he wanted to put in front of 60 people, and naming a man he couldn't fully prove without evidence was not something he would do. But he named the strategy, the raids, the pressure, the timed offers following the fear, and he watched the room's faces as people connected the pieces they'd been carrying separately into the picture they made together. Emmett Cross was in the back. He was very still through Garrick's account, and his face was doing something complicated. Garrick watched him and did not press, because he understood that Cross was a man who needed to arrive at his conclusions through his own route. What do we do? Harlan Briggs asked, which was the same question everyone was thinking. We don't sell, Garrick said. Not one property, not 1 acre. The moment the valley fragments, the strategy works. As long as we hold together, they're spending money and getting nothing. That's easy to say when your operation can absorb a burned barn, a man named Aldred Pruitt said from the middle of the room. He ran a smaller ranch to the southeast and had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been barely managing already. Some of us don't have that margin. I know, Garrick said. That's why this is a collective response. Not every man alone. He looked around the room. I'm proposing that any ranch that suffers a loss this winter gets supported by the others. Shared hay, shared labor, shared watch where the schedule allows. We operate as one entity until this is done. The room was quiet for a moment. This was the kind of proposal that sounded simple and wasn't. It required trust, and trust in a room of men who were frightened and proud and not naturally inclined toward collective action was a delicate ask. Vivian spoke from the side of the room, where she had been standing with Mabel Griggs and Rosaria Vega. My students, she said, and the room turned to her, spent this fall learning to calculate what they were owed and what they owed others. Basic arithmetic, basic fairness. She paused. The people trying to buy this valley are counting on you doing your arithmetic alone. You all know what happens when you do your figures with less information than the other side has. She looked around the room. Together you have the full picture. Separately, you're each working with a fraction of it. The silence held for another moment. Then Emmett Cross said, from the back, I'm in. He said it without elaboration. He said it the way a man says something when he's been carrying it around for a while and has finally decided. Garrick looked at him, and Cross met the look and gave a short nod that communicated several things at once. Agreement, apology, something that was probably as close to shame as Emmett Cross got in public. One by one, the rest of the room added their voices. It was not unanimous. Aldred Pruitt held out, because his situation was genuinely precarious, and Garrick didn't blame him. 2 smaller landholders said they needed to think, but the majority held, and a majority was what was needed. After the meeting, Garrick went to Cross. They stood outside in the cold while the rest of the town filtered away, and Garrick said, low and direct, the watch schedule. Cross's jaw tightened. Wald was at the saloon the same night I was. I didn't tell him directly, but I was... He stopped. I was talking too loud. I know, Garrick said. I'm not going to make an issue of it. You should. I'm not going to, he said again. But I need you solid from here on. No more drinking where Wald or anyone like him can hear you. Wald's gone. Someone else will come, Garrick said. They don't stop sending people until the deal is either done or dead. Cross was quiet for a moment. He looked at the school building, the light still on inside, Vivian visible through the window talking to someone, her hands moving the way they did when she was explaining something. She's something, he said. Not a compliment exactly. Something more honest than that. She is, Garrick said. Adeline wants to write to a university, Cross said. One of the ones in the East, for information about what it takes to enroll. He said it with the particular tone of a man who had been thinking about something for a while and had almost convinced himself. That sounds like Adeline, Garrick said. Does it make any sense? It makes complete sense, Garrick said. Whether she goes or not, that's another question, and it's her question and yours together, but finding out what's possible. He looked at Cross. There's no cost in knowing. Cross put his hat on. He looked at the school one more time. Then he walked to his horse and rode home, and Garrick stood in the cold and thought that some things moved forward in small increments, barely visible, and you only noticed them when you looked back at where you'd started. Inside the school, he found Vivian organizing chairs back into rows, and he picked up the other end of a desk she was moving and helped her, and they worked through the room in a comfortable quiet that had become, over months, one of his preferred ways to be. Adeline's father is going to let her write to a university, he said. Vivian stopped. She turned and looked at him. Something in her face was luminous and quickly controlled, but he'd seen it. You talked to him. Just now. What did you say? That there's no cost in knowing what's possible. He set the desk down. Which is true. She looked at him across the neat rows of student desks, in the lamplight of a schoolroom she had built from a ruin, in a town she had arrived in as a stranger, and she said, I need to go to Boston. I know, he said. I need to go soon. My uncle won't wait much longer before he starts moving legally, and Hargrove said the same thing. Offensive is better than defensive, and I need to be there to be offensive. I know, he said again. The school will manage. Mabel can supervise the daily sessions. Rosaria can take the younger students for reading. She was talking practically, efficiently, because she was frightened and efficiency was her armor, which he had learned to read months ago. I should be back within 6 weeks, 8 at the most. Vivian, she stopped. He came around the desks and stood in front of her, and he looked at her, really looked, the way he rarely let himself because it cost something he was careful with. And he said, I know you're coming back. I'm not worried about that. Then what are you worried about? He thought about how to say it. He was not a man who navigated these particular waters smoothly, had not been for 6 years, and the rust on those skills was real. That you'll get there, he said slowly, and your uncle will make you an offer that looks like everything, and the distance will make Montana look like what it is, and cold and difficult, and a long way from comfort. And you'll remember that you have another option. She looked at him steadily. You think I'd choose comfort over... She stopped. Over what? He didn't answer immediately, because the word he wanted to use was one he hadn't said out loud in 6 years, and it required more courage than fighting off cattle raiders, which was a ridiculous and completely accurate fact. Over this, he said. Over what this is. The lamplight was warm and the room was quiet, and Vivian Mercer looked at him with her dark eyes and her wind-loosened hair and her expression that had stopped calculating and was just present, and she said, What is this, Garrick? I don't know exactly, he said, and the honesty of it was both inadequate and the best he could do. But it's something I don't want to lose. She stepped forward and put her hand flat against his chest, over his coat, and looked up at him, and he felt the pressure of her palm like a fact. I'm coming back, she said. Not for the school, not for Red Hollow. She held his eyes. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, he said. He put his hand over hers where it rested on his coat, and they stood like that in the middle of the schoolroom for a moment, not perfectly, not without the fear on both sides of what it meant to let something matter again. Just two people who had been carrying their separate losses for a long time and had arrived, through circumstance and stubbornness and the particular honesty of shared difficult work, at the edge of something new. She left for Boston on the 6th of January. He drove her to Billings himself, 2 days' travel by wagon, and they talked the whole way, about the school, about Hargrove's strategy, about the legal structure of the trust, and the specific arguments she planned to make to Whitfield and to her uncle. Practical conversation, mostly. But sometimes they lapsed into the other kind, the quieter kind. And when they stopped the first night at a way station, and she fell asleep in the chair by the stove with a case of documents on her lap and her head tipped to one side, he sat across from her and watched the fire and felt the twin weights of tenderness and terror that he was becoming, gradually and without much choice in the matter, accustomed to carrying at the same time. He put her on the eastbound train in Billings and stood on the platform in the January cold and watched the train pull out. Then he turned and walked back toward where the wagon was hitched and thought about what needed doing. The watch schedule, the ranchers, the threat that had not gone away simply because they'd agreed in a schoolroom to face it together. Aldred Pruitt's situation, which required attention before it became a crisis. The unfinished house on the hill, which he had been looking at more directly lately, in the mornings, from the kitchen window, with the feeling he was only just learning to call by its right name. He had work to do. He got in the wagon and drove back toward Red Hollow, and the January sky over Montana was enormous and pale blue and indifferent to everything below it. And the road was hard with cold, and he was, for the first time in 6 years, looking forward rather than back. January in Red Hollow. Without Vivian was quieter than Garrick had expected, and not in a way that felt like peace. He noticed her absence the way you notice a sound that's been running in the background of your life until it stops. Not loudly, not with drama, just a sudden awareness of a space where something had been. The coffee on the stove in the mornings, which he now made himself and drank alone. The kitchen chair at the slight angle she'd placed it months ago, which nobody had moved. The school, which was open and functioning under Mabel's supervision, but which he passed on his rides into town without stopping, because stopping felt like visiting something that wasn't complete. He put that feeling in a drawer in his mind and focused on what needed doing, which was considerable. The raids did not stop because the Valley had agreed to resist them. Whoever was coordinating the operation, Garrick still believed it ran through Leonard Alder's investment arm, though the chain of authority was layered enough to be difficult to prove, had either not received word of the meeting or had decided that unified resistance was a problem to be worn down rather than respected. In the second week of January, Aldred Pruitt lost 40 head from his east pasture. In the third week, someone cut fence line on the Drummond Ranch's northern boundary in 3 places, releasing cattle onto the high ground where the cold and the terrain did more damage than a direct theft. Garrick rode hard in those weeks. He was at Pruitt's within 2 hours of the loss and organized a search with 4 of his own hands that recovered 23 of the 40 by nightfall. He sent Cutter to Drummond with spare fencing and 2 days of labor. He wrote 3 letters, one to a federal marshal in Helena who owed him a conversation if not a favor, one to Foster Bain in Boston asking for more specific documentation on Alder Capital's Western operations, and one to Attorney Hargrove in Billings asking how quickly a civil conspiracy case could be prepared if the documentation materialized. He slept 4 hours a night and felt it, and kept going anyway. The letter from Vivian came in the 3rd week of January. It was not long. She was not a woman who padded letters, but it was precise in the way everything she did was precise, and it told him more than the words said if you knew how to read her, which he was discovering he did. She had met with Hargrove in Billings before departing and arrived in Boston with a legal strategy already in place, which had visibly surprised her uncle and his attorneys. She had sat across from Leonard Alder in his office on Beacon Street, and she described him in the letter as older than I remembered, and more tired than I expected, which made it harder and also made some things clearer. The first meeting had been a negotiation. The second had been closer to a confrontation. The trust, it turned out, had provisions her grandfather had written that her uncle had never fully disclosed to her, provisions that gave her significantly more autonomy than Leonard Alder had found convenient to mention. Hargrove, she wrote, calls it a deliberate omission. I call it something less polite. At the bottom of the letter, after the legal information, was one paragraph that was different in tone from the rest. It said, "Boston is fine. It is exactly what it always was, which is to say, impressive and very cold in a way that has nothing to do with weather. I have had dinner with 3 women who were my friends before Thomas died and who are good people living lives that suit them well. I do not want their lives. I want the one I left in Montana, and I want it with a specificity that has surprised me somewhat. Give Cutter my regards. Tell Remy his handwriting improved more than he knows. And tell whoever is sleeping in my barn room that they should find somewhere else. because I intend to reclaim it." He read that paragraph twice. Then he folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, where it stayed. The federal marshal's name was Aldous Crane, and he arrived in Red Hollow on a Tuesday in early February, riding a good horse and carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent 20 years being the last resort. He was not what Garrick had expected. Smaller, quieter, with a methodical way of asking questions that reminded him somewhat of Vivian, the way she'd ask questions when she first arrived, cataloging rather than pressing. Crane spent 3 days in the valley. He talked to Garrick, Drummond, Pruitt, and 2 other ranchers. He looked at what was left of the burned hay barn. He looked at the cut fence on Drummond's north line. He went to Widow Hadley's and looked at the room Wald had occupied, which Widow Hadley had not yet relet because, she explained firmly, she found the man's residual atmosphere unpleasant. On the evening of the 3rd day, Crane sat at Garrick's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and said, "The documentation from your Boston contact arrived this afternoon by wire. Alder Capital Partners has a paper trail that goes through 3 intermediary companies before it reaches anything that looks like a field operation, but it goes there." He paused. "What I need from you is patience. This kind of case doesn't move fast." "Pruitt doesn't have patience," Garrick said. "He's 1 bad month from selling." "I understand that," Crane said, "which is why I need something visible. A public action that tells whoever is running the field operation that there is federal attention on this valley." He looked at his coffee. "I'm going to make some inquiries about the men who hit Drummond and Pruitt. If I can bring in anyone with a direct connection to the acquisition company, that changes the calculus for everyone." "And Alder?" Crane looked at him steadily. "A Boston financier directing a land acquisition scheme in Montana through intermediary companies is a civil matter more than a criminal one. The raids are criminal. The connection between them and Alder, that's where it gets complicated." He paused. "Your, Mrs. Mercer's legal action in Boston is actually the sharper instrument there. If she can demonstrate that the acquisition strategy was designed in part to limit her options and coerce her return, that opens avenues that my jurisdiction doesn't give me. You did, Miss Garrick thought about Vivian sitting across from her uncle in a Beacon Street office with the legal strategy she'd built in advance. He thought about what Hargrove had called a deliberate omission. He thought about the woman who had arrived in his barn 4 months ago with a trunk full of books and had looked at Red Hollow the way a surveyor looks at terrain, measuring without flinching. "She'll find the avenues," he said. "I gathered that," Crane said, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. The action Crane had spoken of came in the 2nd week of February. 3 men were apprehended in the hills north of Red Hollow, attempting to move a cut herd, 42 cattle, from Prentice's eastern pasture toward a holding ground that Crane's inquiries had identified as the operation's staging point. The arrests were not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes made frontier justice sound. They were cold and dark and involved a significant amount of waiting in the snow before anything happened. And when it did happen, it was muddy and effortful, and one of Garrick's hands came home with a broken finger from a moment of confusion in the dark. But they were in custody. And in custody, under Crane's particular brand of patient questioning, one of the 3 began to talk. What he said took several days to assemble into anything useful because he knew only his piece of the structure, which was how these operations were designed. But his piece connected to a supervisor in Billings, whose name appeared in 2 of the documents Bain had forwarded from Boston. And that connection was the thread Crane had been looking for. He sent Garrick a wire from Billings on the 18th of February. Billings connection confirmed. Civil referral filed today to Boston Courts re Alder Capital. Your attorney in Billings has been notified. The field operation is effectively ended. Without the acquisitions proceeding, there is no commercial rationale for further action in your valley. Garrick read it at the kitchen table in the early morning and sat with it for a while. The hay barn was still a ruin in the east field. Pruitt had not sold but had come close twice, and the anxiety of that period had aged him visibly. Drummond had 3 miles of fence to rerun in the spring. The valley had held, but holding had cost things, and the cost was real and worth naming. He sent a wire to Vivian in Boston that said, "Valley is clear. Come home when you're ready." He thought about it for a moment and then added, "Whenever that is." She arrived on the 14th of March. He knew she was coming. She had written with the date and the train time, and he'd driven to Billings to meet the train, which was a full day in each direction, and he didn't think particularly hard about what that said about him. He stood on the platform in the Billings station in the early afternoon and watched the train come in from the east, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, something simple and slightly terrifying that he had no intention of not feeling. She came off the train in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark blue, and she was carrying her own bag and moving with the particular purposefulness of someone who has been traveling for days and is finished being patient about it. She saw him before he said anything, looked across the platform, and found him. And the expression on her face was not dramatic or performed, it was just recognition. The specific kind that means the person you were looking for is the person you found. She walked to him and stopped and looked up at him. "You drove all the way to Billings," she said. "Train doesn't go to Red Hollow," he said. "It doesn't go to the edge of Red Hollow either, which is where you could have met me." "That's true," he said. She studied him for a moment. Her hair had come loose on one side, and she didn't fix it. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has done something hard and necessary and is on the other side of it. "The trust is resolved," she said. "I'll tell you the details on the way back. The short version is that Hargrove found language in my grandfather's original documents that my uncle had been interpreting creatively for 15 years. A judge in Boston found the interpretation unconvincing." She paused. "My uncle and I had a final conversation in his office on Beacon Street last week. It was not comfortable, but it was honest, which is more than most conversations we've had." "How did it end?" She was quiet for a moment. "He asked me if I was happy," she said. "I told him I was getting there. He said—" She stopped, and something moved across her face. "He said my father would have liked my choices. I don't know if it's true, but he said it." Garrick didn't say anything. He picked up her bag. "The Valley," she said, walking beside him. Crane made arrests. The operation folded. Pruitt held on. Everyone's still standing. He paused. Adeline Cross wrote to a botanical institute in Philadelphia. They wrote back. Vivian stopped walking. "They offered her a correspondence course," he said, "conditional on completing the equivalent of secondary school requirements, which she will do by summer at the rate she's going." He looked at her. Cross is letting her take it. She looked at him with something luminous and thoroughly unguarded on her face, and she said, "That man," meaning Emmett Cross, with an affection that held everything, the confrontation in the schoolroom, the hat turning in his hands, the word "she's home by 4" as the closest he could get to an apology. "He's not a bad man," Garrick said, "just a frightened one." "Most bad behavior is," she said. They drove back to Red Hollow through the March day, which was still cold but had a quality of light in it that February didn't, something that suggested the season was considering its options. The mountains had snow on the high peaks, but the valley floor was beginning to show through in patches, brown and bare and alive underneath. She told him about Boston in detail, about the meetings and the legal arguments and the specific provisions in her grandfather's trust that her uncle had quietly reinterpreted over 15 years. About the moment in the courtroom, not a dramatic moment, just a procedural one, a judge reading language from a document, when she understood that it was over and she had won, and what she had felt was not triumph so much as relief, the specific relief of something that has been hanging over you finally landing. "What does it mean?" he asked. "The trust." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. "It means I have resources I hadn't allowed myself to count on," she said. "More than I'd thought. My grandfather he believed in education. It's why he included the provisions he did. He wanted his money used for something." She paused. "I've been thinking about what that looks like." He waited. "The school needs a proper building," she said. "Not the one we're using. Something built for the purpose, with space for more students, a library, proper equipment for the older students doing more advanced work." She glanced at him. "Red Hollow also needs a hotel, which I am not building, but which someone should. And Pruitt's operation needs stabilizing. Not charity, a loan at a fair rate from someone who isn't trying to acquire his land when he can't pay it back." He was quiet, listening. "I want to use the money here," she said. "Not all of it. I'm not reckless, but a portion significantly in this valley, in ways that matter." She looked at him directly. "I want to know what you think." He considered it. He thought about what Cutter had said months ago. Someone's running a business here, and how the same could be said of generosity if you were serious about it. Money spent on things that lasted was not charity, it was investment, and the return was not always financial. I think it's sound, he said. I think Hargrove should structure it so the school has an endowment rather than depending on one-time funding. I think the loan to Pruitt should have formal terms so his pride can live with it. He paused. I think you should talk to Rosaria Vega about what the community needs, because she sees things the rest of us miss. She looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize as the one she wore when something surprised her in a direction she hadn't expected. You've thought about this, she said. I've had 2 months to think, he said. They came over the last rise before the valley opened up, and Red Hollow lay below them in the March afternoon light, small, imperfect, real. The single road through town, the smoke from chimneys, the school building at the east end with its new windows and its patched roof and a light on inside because Mabel ran the afternoon session regardless of weather. Further out, the ranches dotting the valley floor, each one a person he knew, a family that had held through a winter that had tried to take things from them. Vivian looked at it. She did the thing she'd done the very first time she saw this valley, that slight opening in her expression, the shutter unlatching. I missed it, she said, quietly, like something private said aloud by accident. I know, he said. He drove her to the ranch. Cutter was in the yard when they pulled in, and he looked at the wagon and nodded once at Vivian with something in his face that was as close to warmth as Cutter Walsh expressed publicly. Rosaria's been teaching the Tuesday sessions while Mabel's been running the daily ones, he said, by way of greeting. She's better at it than she thinks she is. I'll tell her so, Vivian said. Don't tell her I said it, Cutter said, and went back to what he'd been doing. Remy came out of the barn and stopped when he saw Vivian and said, with the uncomplicated relief of someone for whom things were better when the right people were present, You're back. He said it the way Tommy Prentice might have said it, direct and unashamed. I'm back, she said. That evening, Garrick built a fire in the main house's front room, which he didn't always do. It was extra wood and he was alone most evenings and the kitchen was warmer anyway. But Vivian was back and it was March, and the front room had a view of the valley through its single large window, and some occasions deserved a fire simply because they did. They sat on opposite sides of the fire with coffee, and she told him the rest of it, the parts of Boston she hadn't gotten to on the road. The conversation with her uncle that had been more complicated than the legal resolution. The specific moment when she'd understood that her uncle's control over her life had always been a kind of love and always been a kind of damage, and that both things were true simultaneously and neither canceled the other. I'm not angry at him anymore, she said. She said it like she was still deciding whether it was true, testing the weight of it. I think I was for a long time, but he's a man who loves things by owning them, and he never learned another way, and that's sad more than it's villainous. It caused real damage, Garrick said, to you and to this valley. It did, she agreed. Both things can be true. He looked at her across the fire. She had her boots off and her feet tucked under her in the chair that had been, for as long as he could remember, a chair where nobody sat because it was in a room he didn't use. It looked like it had always had someone in it. I want to show you something, he said. He got his coat, she got hers, and they went out into the March night, which was cold and clear and enormous with stars, and he walked her up the rise to the north of the main house, to the place where the framing stood dark against the sky, the skeleton of what had been supposed to be and had stopped. She had stood here before. He'd known she had, that morning months ago. But she stood here now differently, and he stood beside her and looked at it the way he'd been practicing looking at it since January, directly rather than away. I want to finish it, he said. She was quiet. Not because it was Clara's, he said, and this was the hard part, the part that required saying carefully. It was. And that's real, and it doesn't go away. But leaving it unfinished doesn't honor that. It just... He stopped. It just keeps something broken in a visible place and calls that grief. When did you decide? She asked. January, he said, looking at it from the kitchen window. He paused. The morning I put you on the train. She looked at the framing, at the open spaces where walls would go, where windows would be. at the view from this rise that on a clear night like this showed the whole valley from south to north, exactly as Clara had wanted to see it each morning. The creek was a dark line below. The town lights were scattered and small. The mountains were black against the stars. "It's a remarkable view," she said. "It is," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The distance between them was small and both of them were aware of it. "Garrick," she said. "I know what I want," he said. "I've known for a while. I'm not—" He stopped, because the language for this was not language he'd used in a long time, and it had some rust on it. "I'm not good at the saying of it." "You're better than you think," she said. "I want to finish the house," he said. "I want to have a reason to finish it." She stepped forward and put both her hands on his chest, over his coat, the same way she had in the schoolroom 3 months ago, and she looked up at him with her dark eyes in the starlight, and she said, "You have a reason." He put his arms around her, and she let herself be held, and they stood on the rise above the valley they had both, by different roads and different costs, arrived at and decided was theirs. It was not a perfect moment. He was cold and she was tired from 3 days of travel, and the wind came off the mountains with its characteristic indifference, and there was a ruin of an unfinished house around them. But it was real, and real was worth more than perfect, and he was old enough and had lost enough to know the difference. They were married in late May, when the cottonwoods at the south edge of the property had come back into their fullness, and the valley had turned the particular green that only lasted a few weeks before summer bleached it back toward gold. Vivian had wanted it small. Garrick had agreed to small, and then watched it quietly become large through no direct action of his own, as the community he had helped hold together through the winter decided, apparently collectively, that this was a thing worth celebrating. Mabel organized something involving tables and food. Rosaria made things nobody had names for but ate completely. Tommy Prentice and his brother Daniel showed up with their hair visibly dampened and combed, which Garrick understood as the maximum formal effort available to 11 and 13-year-olds, and which he appreciated. Adeline Cross was there, and she had in her coat pocket a letter she'd received the previous week from the Botanical Institute in Philadelphia, acknowledging the completion of her first correspondence examination with distinction. She told Vivian quietly, before the ceremony began, and Vivian hugged her in a way that was slightly undignified and entirely right. Emmett Cross stood off to the side during most of the gathering, watching, in the manner of a man who was not entirely comfortable with celebrations but had decided to be present anyway. At one point Garrick found himself standing near Cross, and Cross said without preamble, "She's a good woman." "She is," Garrick said. "Stubborn," Cross said. "Yes." Cross was quiet for a moment. "My Adeline wants to go to Philadelphia," he said. "Eventually. To the Institute." "She probably will," Garrick said. Cross turned his hat in his hands, that old gesture, the one that meant he was thinking harder than he was talking. "I'm working on being all right with it," he said. "That's the whole job," Garrick said. "Working on it." Cross put his hat on and went to find his wife, and Garrick watched him go and thought that sometimes people didn't transform, they just adjusted, inch by inch, and that this was worth something, even if it wasn't worth celebrating loudly. The ceremony happened under the cottonwoods where Vivian's first school session had been held, outside because the school building was too small for the number of people who showed up, and because the day was extraordinary, clear and warm with the mountains visible in every direction. Garrick and Vivian stood under those trees and said the words that mattered in front of the people who had witnessed the winter and the work, and the making of something that neither of them had planned. He did not know, standing there, whether the next years would be easy. He was not a man who expected ease. The hay barn was rebuilt, but the east fence still needed work in 3 sections. Pruitt's loan arrangement was in place, but would require monitoring. The school's new building was being planned, but planning was not building, and building took time and money and the particular stubbornness that any real project demanded. And Vivian was not an easy woman, by which he meant she was not a simple one. She had opinions, and she expressed them, and she was wrong sometimes with the same completeness she was right, and she had wounds from her own history that would surface at odd moments in ways neither of them could fully predict. He knew this because he knew her, the real version, not the version he'd met stepping off a stagecoach 4 months earlier, but the one that had emerged through a winter of shared difficulty and shared work and the slow, unglamorous process of 2 people learning each other. He was glad for all of it, the difficulty included, That was the thing he understood now that he hadn't let himself understand for 6 years. Loss did not make love foolish. Clara had died, and that was real, and would always be real, and loving Vivian was also real, and both things could be true simultaneously. The empty house on the hill was not a monument to the failure of caring. It was just unfinished work waiting for the right season. You did not betray the dead by continuing to live. You betrayed them, if anything, by treating their absence as a reason to stop. He had wasted 6 years on that particular misunderstanding. He did not intend to waste any more. The new building went up that summer. Vivian's funds covered the materials and a portion of the labor. But half the labor came from people who showed up with tools on a Saturday morning because they wanted a school in Red Hollow, and this was how you built things in a place where the nearest construction firm was 40 miles away. Garrick worked alongside them, and Cutter worked alongside Garrick. And at one point, Tommy Prentice appeared with a small hammer that was clearly not his and demanded to be given something useful to do, and was. The endowment Vivian established was modest by Boston standards and significant by Red Hollow standards, and Hargrove had structured it with the kind of quiet permanence that meant it would still exist in 40 years, regardless of who held the teaching position or what happened to the ranching economy or whether the railroad ever came through. Pruitt's loan was paid back in 3 years, ahead of schedule, with an additional letter from Pruitt that said he appreciated the fair terms and intended to pass the favor forward someday, which was more than Garrick had expected and exactly what Vivian had. Rosaria Vega became the school's second teacher by September for the younger students, because there were now 34 of them, and one person could not manage 34 children across 4 age groups without something giving way. She was paid a real salary from the endowment, and she accepted it without the complicated negotiations about charity that Vivian had anticipated, because Rosaria Vega was a practical woman who knew the value of her own work. The house on the hill was finished in October the second year. It took longer than planned. It always does, with anything that matters. And there were arguments about windows and a significant disagreement about the kitchen layout that Garrick lost on the merits, and Vivian won with an argument he found irritating and correct. The parlor faced south. The front porch faced east, over the full length of the valley, both mountain ranges visible on a clear day, the creek catching light at the bottom. They moved in on a Thursday in October, when the cottonwoods were gold and the air had the specific sharpness of approaching winter, and there were things that still needed doing. A room that had no furniture, a fence around the kitchen garden that was more aspiration than structure. But it was a house, and it was theirs. And when Vivian stood on the front porch in the morning light with her coffee and looked out at the valley he had looked out at his entire life, she said, "She was right." "About what?" he said. "Every morning does feel like something," she said. He stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and he thought about Clara, who had wanted this view, and Vivian, who was standing in it, and himself, who had almost let a grief calcify into a permanent reason not to continue. He thought about Tommy Prentice asking whether the bad men were coming, and Vivian saying, "Your job is to learn." He thought about Adeline Cross with her letter in her coat pocket. He thought about Emmett Cross turning his hat in his hands and saying, "I'm working on being all right with it," and how that sentence, unglamorous and incomplete, was probably the most honest thing anyone had said all year. He thought about what it meant to choose, not once, but repeatedly, every day, against the gravity of habit and fear, and the comfortable weight of what you'd already decided you were. Garrick Hale was not a different man than he had been when Vivian Mercer stepped off the stagecoach into the dust of Red Hollow. He was the same man, with the same scars and the same stubbornness and the same difficulty saying the things that mattered. But he had chosen, over and over again through a winter that had tried to take things from him, to hold what was worth holding. The land, the people, the woman beside him on the porch. And that, in the end, was what wealth meant. Not the acreage, not the cattle, not the trust fund, or the legal victory, or the endowment with its quiet permanence. It meant knowing what was worth the cost of protecting it. It meant choosing it again every morning, even when the morning was cold and the work was hard, and nothing about it was easy or finished or perfect. It meant standing on a porch in October, looking at a valley that was beautiful and difficult and real, and feeling, without qualification, that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.